Hi everyone, and welcome to our 8th night of storytelling. This story is a little shorter than some of the others have been. It's actually a story that's quite close to my heart because it's from Lincolnshire, where I grew up. It's called The Dark Moon. It's a really old, very, very old folk story that I came across a few years back. Um, and it is a little scary, but it's you don't have to worry. This is very traditional in that everything comes out okay in the end. So I'd like to invite you to relax, to curl up with your favorite drink or your pillow or your soft toy, whatever it is you like to relax with. And the story of the Dark Moon begins now. If you were to walk through Lincolnshire now, Lincolnshire on the east coast of England, you would see mostly agricultural fields. But that was not the case 800, 1,000, 2,000 years ago. In fact, this land was treacherous. Lincolnshire was filled with bogs and marshes and fens, and it was as if the sea itself wanted to claim it back for its own. And that meant that it was a treacherous place to travel sometimes from one village to the next. And when people did so, they did so with care. For you had to travel very narrow paths between the villages, and should you stray from those paths, it was possible to be drowned in the bogs and the marshes that lurked everywhere. But not only that, inside these bogs and marshes, there were creatures called boogles. And boogles were very small, sometimes hairy, very spindly little creatures with extremely long arms and legs. And they had hideous cackle, and they were always covered in swampy weeds. And they were pretty mischievous to the point of being evil. And one of the things that boogles liked to do was to lure travellers from the path, to try to get them to step aside into the marshes, where they would sometimes sink up to their necks and be drowned. So the marshes and the fens were a difficult place to travel, especially by night when the boogles came out. But the one thing that made these marshes safer was the Lady Moon. And the Lady Moon would shine her light down on the fens, and whenever she did so, the boogles would become afraid and enraged at the beauty of her light, and they would scamper away and leave the travellers to go their way in safety. And the travellers, even if the boogles didn't leave, would be able to see the path ahead of them and would feel safe and secure. And so it was only because of the Lady Moon that people could travel through the bogs and the fens at night. But the Lady Moon would look down on the fens night after night, and she wondered at these strange creatures. And good and true and courageous though she was pretty curious too. And one night she decided to go down to the fens and to see these boogles for herself. And so she jumped down from her seat in the heavens, and she jumped into the Lincolnshire fens and started to walk along the pathways, her golden white hair shining and her golden white robe shining with the light she brought with her. And the boogles taunted her on the pathways, taunted her though they were quite afraid, until one boogle grew more courageous than all the rest, and he rushed forward and he nudged the Lady Moon from the pathway, and she lost her footing, and she fell into a stinking bog by the side of the path, and instantly all the boogles were upon her, and all the boogles rolled a giant stone over the Lady Moon until she was trapped in the bog forever. Now it just so happened that there was one traveller making his way between the villages who witnessed the whole thing. He saw the boogles ganging up on the Lady Moon, and he saw them push, and he saw them roll the giant stone to trap her down in the marsh. But this man was so afraid that he barely registered the sight of the frightened eyes gazing up at him from the pond. He barely registered the sight of the gold-white hair floating down in pondweed, and instead he ran for his life. He ran until he reached the village that was his home, and he ran inside and he slammed the door. And this was a village that was surrounded in fens. This was a village that relied on those narrow pathways between other villages for its survival. And it was also a village where there were two people vying for power. One was a woman, which was quite unusual in those times. And she was powerful, and she was good, and she was strong, and she always came up with great ideas that would help all the villagers through difficult times. And the other was a devious and somewhat cruel man who was in his late 50s and who only wanted power because his father had had power before him and his father before him. And he was determined that whatever happened, he would become the next mayor of the village and not his rival. Well, his rival's name was Eva, and she knew what she was up against. But there was very little she could do because at the point this story starts, it was her rival, the hereditary ruler of the village, who was most favoured by everyone, if only because she was a woman. And that night, a strange thing happened. At the time when they expected the moon to shine its brightest in the sky, there was no moon came out at all. And all the villagers huddled in their cottages. And when they looked out, they could see the boogles in the forest and in the marshes. They could see the boogles at the very edge of the village, and where the boogles would normally never dare to come into the clearing, to come into the village, because that's where moonlight shone brightest. Now they were becoming more courageous. And by the second night, as the villagers huddled in their cottages, the boogles were scampering up to the windows, and they were peering inside, and they were clawing at the latches on the doors. And the villagers became even more afraid. And by the third night there was still no moon, and the boogles were climbing up the walls of the cottages and scampering across the roofs and reaching their hands down the chimneys. "What are we to do?" cried the villagers. "What are we to do? Because if this continues, none of us know how we're going to survive. How can we even move between villages at night when there is no moon? What has happened to the Lady Moon? And why are the boogles here?" Well, at that point, the guy who wanted to be mayor stepped forward into the clearing in the village, and he said to everybody, "I know what the boogles want. The boogles want a sacrifice. They want one of us to give our lives and to go out into the marsh and to give ourselves to the boogles. And if the boogles have their sacrifice, then they'll leave us all alone." And he looked to the young woman who was his rival. "Eva should be the sacrifice," he said. And because everybody was afraid somewhat at the idea of a woman taking power in the village, they started to wonder at this. Are the boogles here punishing us all because we were about to have a woman as our leader? Is that why the boogles are climbing our walls and peering down our chimneys? Because they don't agree with a woman ruling us all? And they started to listen to this man. And soon they started to grow so afraid that Eva knew that she was about to be chosen as a sacrifice. And so she held up her hand and she said, "I agree to go out into the marsh and to face the boogles on your behalf. And if I come back alive, you will know that it was intended all along that I should be leader of the village." And she went into her cottage and she wondered what it was she was going to do. She had no choice but to face the boogles. Well, just 3 nights ago, a man had witnessed what had happened to the moon. And for the very 3 nights after that, in fear of the boogles themselves, he had spent his days and nights in the tavern, drinking ale and drowning his sorrows and not thinking clearly. But it just so happened that as he grew to sober that day, he started to remember what he'd seen in the marshes. He started to remember the sight of the Lady Moon, how she'd been trapped under a stone in the deepest, darkest part of the fen. And knowing that Eva was about to be sacrificed, he ran to see her, and he asked her if he could tell her what he'd seen. And he reported that the reason the Lady Moon was not shining at night was that she had come down to the earth, and she'd walked through the Lincolnshire fens, and that she'd been knocked off the path by the Boogles, and that she was imprisoned under a stone. "You must go set her free," said the man. "While you're in the fens, if you can set her free, then you set free all of us from the horror of the Boogles. For even if the Boogles eat you, there's certainly no way that any of us are going to live free until the moon is back in the sky." And he left, and the young woman, she thought on his words. And then her mother paid her a visit, her mother who knew more magic than anyone else in the village. And she said, "Eva, there are 2 things you must do. If you are to rescue the Lady Moon, you must carry in your cheek a stone, for stones are older than the Boogles themselves, and that will protect you from their magic. And secondly, do not look a Boogle in the eye. Do these 2 things, and you should be able to work your way through the fens and set free the Lady Moon." Well, the very next night, the villagers escorted Eva to the edge of the village, to the track that led through the fens. And as the sun set, and there was no moon to rise in its place, Eva ventured out into the fens alone. Unknown to anyone else, she held a stone in her mouth, and she held her sight on the track ahead, and did not look to the left or to the right, where the Boogles reached out with their spindly arms towards her, but could not catch her, could not touch her. And Eva worked her way through the darkness of the fens, using only the mysterious light of the twinkling will-o'-the-wisps to show her the way. And she was aware of the Boogles to her left and to her right. She was aware of the fingers that reached out as if to grab her, but she did not look. She did not look at anywhere but the track ahead of her, until at last she came to a deep, dark bog. And there she saw a stone, and shining around the stone a strange silver light, and shining around the stone strange silvery gold hair rising up through the bog. And she reached forwards, and she saw 2 eyes in the marsh, 2 eyes pleading with her to set her free. And Eva was so shocked at what she saw, so taken up with pity for the Lady Moon lying there in the bog, that she opened her mouth and gasped. And as she did so, the stone fell out of her cheek and fell into the water of the marsh. And now the Boogles were all around her, taunting her and cackling. "I must not look at you, I must not look at you," cried Eve, and she closed her eyes tight. And using only her hands, she waded out into the bog until she could feel the surface of the giant stone, and aware that the Boogles were reaching out at her from every angle, and that she only had to open her eyes and see one of them for them to clutch at her and plunge her deep into the fog, deep into the fens. She ignored everything around her, kept her eyes clenched tightly shut, and reached out, and she rolled back the stone. And as she did so, she was aware of a blinding white light as the Lady Moon was released and rose to the surface, and she heard the screams of the Boogles as they leapt back. And the Lady Moon rose up before her, and the Lady Moon rose higher and higher as a white ball in the sky. And Eva opened her eyes, and just for a second she saw her in all her glory, in her white, gold and silver gown, with her long flowing hair. And the Lady Moon drifted up towards the sky, casting her white, gold, silver light over everything. And Eva stepped back, and she heard the enraged screams of the Boogles as they disappeared off into the marshes. And Eva stepped safely onto the track, and she made her way along the trail back towards the village. And everybody had seen the moonlight pouring across their cottages, and everyone had seen the moonlight pouring across the fens, and the boogles retreating into the deepest, darkest parts of the marsh. And as dawn came, the villagers celebrated. They took Eva on their shoulders, and they carried her through the village, for she had saved them all. And when they got to the courtyard in the middle of the village, they let her off their shoulders, and there was a great feast to celebrate. And Eva's rival knew that if he stuck around, the anger of the villagers would pour onto him. And so he gathered his belongings, and while he still could, for he was too afraid to travel by dark, he slunk off through the marshes to find himself another village to live in. And by the end of the day, Eva had been asked to be leader of them all, and she used her wisdom and her courage and her strength to lead that village into great things in the days and the weeks and the months that followed. And the boogles never once again encroached upon the territory of the village. And every night, when the Lady Moon shone down from her seat in the sky, she shone over the whole world. But there was always one small village in the heart of the Lincolnshire fens that she would shine upon the brightest of all. And that is the story of the dark moon. Thank you all for listening, and there'll be another story tomorrow night.